Many early career scientists move to different institutions, which can also be quite often in another country, in order to broaden their horizons and to learn new skills. Now, in this brief video, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience. And I have to tell you from the beginning that I moved prior to Brexit. So my experience might have been a little bit different because I didn't have to worry about visas, for instance. And obviously this was during a pandemic, so the travel was also not such a big deal. Now for me, London had a big appeal. First of all, it was only a train ride away, so it's very convenient to just take the Eurostar and go across the channel. But it's also very international. So I knew I would meet lots of international people there and that it wouldn't feel as isolated as maybe moving to like a small city where you have to start from scratch. So when you go there, you will meet lots of people who are kind of in the same boat. And that was exactly my experience. So when I started there were lots of international people who started around the same time, didn't really know anyone, didn't have family there. So it was very easy to make new contacts and new friends. Now, moving can be quite tricky as well. And one of the things that I realized straight away, this is not just as a scientist, but one of the tricky things is obviously you have to find a place to live. And in the UK, you can't do that without having a bank account. But likewise, you can't set up a bank account either, like without having an address. So in the first couple of weeks when I moved there, one of the first things I had to do, and in the end in the bank they knew it just by my first name, was just sorting these problems out. So it's very important that your employer supports you with that process. Well, one of the reasons for going to London is that there's just so many universities around. So they have more universities there than they have like in the whole of my country. So in terms of science, there's lots of opportunities that you can pursue. So many people would also consider the language not a barrier because most people would speak English. And in my case, particularly because in Dutch universities, your degree is in English, you didn't have to do a language test. So that made some of these things a little bit easier. Well, I don't think you can compare living in London with the rest of the UK. So I lived in Manchester and Newcastle after that. So these are still big cities. So it's still probably a bit different and probably a bit more international than like a typical UK city. So your experience that you would have is quite different. And I can compare this to if you would move to the Netherlands and most tourists would only go to Amsterdam and maybe to Rotterdam. So living there is not the same as actually like being part of the country and experience what it's like. So I think I can compare like at least the Netherlands, Belgium and the UK in terms of formalities and how you interact with people on a daily basis. So this can be it's divided between how you interact with your students and how you do this with your colleagues. Now, Dutch people tend to be quite informal, but you wouldn't necessarily have a lot of interactions between the students and the instructors. So let me talk a little bit first about how the interactions with people and with your colleagues is in general. So I thought in Belgium there was definitely a bit more formalities when it came between you, your boss, and other people, like other group leaders within the institute. So when I went to the UK, I felt that was like, in terms of formality, a little bit in between both. So UK people tend to be really polite, which is sometimes nice, but it's also sometimes very difficult to see what they think. And I had a similar experience in Belgium. But I have to say, in Belgium, I interacted less with, for instance, some of the other people that were not my boss, as some of the other group leaders. And then in the UK, you were a little bit more embedded in the system. Now, what I would say is that when it comes to interactions with students, this is much more different compared to the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, you would have, for instance, PhD students mainly helping out with tutorials, but I never had that much interaction with the actual professors themselves. I think I've mainly seen them like twice when you would have a look at some of the exams and had a look at some of the mistakes you made, but that was about it. You wouldn't just knock on their door and go and ask them for things. Now, in the UK, this is very different. So I never experienced the concept of office hours, but you have like certain times where the students can come and see you. But even though you have that, it would be more common that you actually see them outside of these hours. So probably more email contact, but also more personal contact with like an open door policy where they can come and see you and ask you questions. So in a way, that's also kind of nice because you get to know the students a bit better. Going through as they progress throughout their studies and you see what kind of job they get into. So in the Netherlands, I never really had that, except for when you started doing your final year project, where you are in more close contact with your instructor, and they are more interested in what you apply for after. And then what I said, even though the language is not really a barrier, all the processes are different. So I definitely thought that the UK system is a lot more bureaucratic, a lot more focused on meetings that I was used to in the Netherlands. So while the language is not a barrier, as I said, because of the English, but it's the way you interact with people is. And then the education system is very different in the UK. So in the Netherlands, for instance, you don't have private schools. So I really had to get my head around how this works in the UK and how people actually apply for universities and what the requirements of getting into universities are. Because in the Netherlands, you don't have a thing like where you have to do interviews, for instance. But because the UK grant funding system is very different, you really can't rely on just European connections. Because especially at the moment with Brexit, it is even more complex to get European funding. But also because most of the UK-based funding, you need either a company or probably like a national collaborator. And even if you would have an international one, it would be very difficult for them to get money from the grant. And that doesn't make it very appealing for other people to be on there, even though there are ways you can maybe get around this. So with any job, it can take a little bit of time to find your feet and to get used to how they work in a different organization. So when you move internationally, then I said this is part of even just finding a new place to live, maybe having to deal with visas and other things. But beyond that, I think even after a year in, you still realize that there are lots of things that are new. So I had to get my head around the fact that there were lots of, even though I've been working in this place for nearly 3 years, there's still procedures and things that I wasn't familiar with. And that tends to be a typical UK thing, which is slightly more bureaucratic. What I have benefited from, I think, is because we had a lot of exchange students and also master students. So you have closer contact with the students. So I think like by working with them, it has definitely benefited me in terms of getting the most out of their research and also just seeing how they actually develop their potential. So sometimes it can be just as beneficial to build up your network or to learn new skills, to go somewhere for a few weeks or a few months, rather than having to start from scratch and having to go through this whole painful moving process and getting used to a new organization and meeting new people. I do think it has benefited me in my career because I've got quite a big network now, and you also have to start from scratch. And I think you kind of show that you are independent and that you know how to do this. If you want to know a little bit more about some quirky British habits or what I think are strange Dutch habits and a comparison between that, then please have a look at some of the videos in this playlist.